Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with 7 ontological arguments for the existence of God. In this video we're going to be doing objections to the Meinongian Ontological Argument for the existence of God. If you have not checked out my previous video on the Meinongian argument, you might want to do that. And if you are unfamiliar with Meinong's theory of objects, you might want to brush up on that or check out my video on Meinong's jungle or the theory of objects. With that out of the way, let's get going. So, the Meinongian ontological argument goes as follows. All instances of the statement, the FG is F, are true. The existent perfect being is existent is true. Therefore, the existent perfect being exists. Therefore, God exists. In this video, I'm going to take a look at some objections to each of these premises, primarily the first two. Now, the first premise, all instances of the statement, the FG is F, are true. The most simple way to object to this premise is to simply reject Meinong's ontology. If one doesn't accept Meinong's theory of objects, there's going to be no reason to accept premise 1. Bertrand Russell offered us some reasons we might not want to accept Meinong's theory. The claim that the round square is round and is not round is contradictory. And 2, although in fact the King of France does not exist, the characterization principle implies that he does exist. If you're curious why those things fall out of Meinong's theory, like I said, check out my previous video. Meinong was able to respond to these. If you're convinced by his responses, maybe these objections won't succeed. Let's take a look. As to the first point, the claim that the round square is round and is not round is contradictory, what Meinong's going to say is, when it comes to non-being, we should reject the law of non-contradiction in favor of a more lenient version. Basically what he's saying here is that it doesn't matter about property negation, that property negation is not in fact going to cause us to end up in a contradiction, that only sentence negation will. It looks a little different in the logical form, and I go into it in a lot more depth in my other video, so I'm not going to get into it too much here. If you're convinced by this new law of contradiction, maybe you think this response will succeed. Meinong is also going to respond to 2. Although in fact the King of France does not exist, the characterization principle implies that he does exist. Meinong's going to say that there are 2 kinds of existence we're talking about. Existence that all objects have, this kind of outside existence, and being, that's something that's had by some but not all objects. In fact, the King of France is going to have the property of non-being, or perhaps he will have neither the property of being nor non-being, depending on what we really mean by the King of France. One way or another, he's not going to have the property of being, so in that sense of existence, he's not going to exist. But in the outside sense of existence, he's going to have that kind of existence. So, to respond to that, we're going to be talking about 2 different kinds of existence. Russell wasn't terribly convinced by that, but that's going to be how Meinong is going to defend his ontology. With that understanding, let's move into the main objection here, which is an objection to premise 2. The existent perfect being is existent is true. It's important to remember that there are 2 different possible readings of the characterization principle. I went over this in my previous video, but I want to go over it again. The characterization principle, any object has those properties that it is characterized as having. The xy is x and y. There are 2 readings of this principle. Either one that makes it analytically true, that makes the statement the xy is x and y analytically true, but does not make an existential claim, a claim that something exists, and the reading which is synthetically true, which in fact does make an existential claim. Let's take a look. The analytically true version expresses pure objects without any existential commitment. Those are objects that only have the properties of being x and being y. They don't even have the properties of being or non-being. So we can't be expressing an existential claim because we're not expressing anything about their properties of being. Synthetically true statements, on the other hand, are going to express actual objects with existential commitment. So if they don't exist, it's going to be false. The synthetically true version, it's important to note, can be false, while the analytically true one can't. If we take, for example, the statement, the eclipsed sun is eclipsed, in both cases. In the analytically true reading, this would be the pure object of the eclipsed sun is eclipsed. That pure object has 2 properties, being eclipsed and being the sun. It does not have the property of being or non-being necessarily. So it is some pure object that may neither exist nor not exist. We're not making an existential claim, so this claim is going to always be true because the only properties that are important about this object are that it is eclipsed and that it is a sun. So, of course, it's going to be analytically true. But it's important to note, pure objects don't exist in the same way as objects that have being exist. They don't exist in the actual world. In the synthetically true reading of the statement, the actual sun is eclipsed. It seems that simply by saying the eclipsed sun is eclipsed, one cannot make the actual sun be eclipsed, clearly. So, under the synthetically true reading of the statement, we need something more. We need something beyond that statement to make it true. We need empirical information. That's the idea of it being a synthetic statement. When Meinong uses the characterization principle, and he makes this very clear, he's talking about the analytically true version, not the synthetically true version. So, to use the xy is x and y, you are only talking about something that does not exist, or does not have being, at least. That does not make an existential claim. If you are using the characterization principle at all, you're already talking about something that doesn't make an existential claim. If you try to use it in the synthetic sense that does make an existential claim, you're not using the characterization principle, and your claim is not going to be supported by Meinong's theories. With that in mind, let's take a look at this in terms of the ontological argument. So, the existent perfect being is existent in both cases. The pure object of the existent perfect being is existent. Once again, the pure object has neither the property of being nor non-being. So, it's not going to be making a claim about that thing actually existing. It's not going to actually be making that existential claim in the same way that we would in the synthetically true version, or in the same way that we would understand simply by saying that the eclipsed sun is eclipsed, the sun would become eclipsed. Unless you have more information to make it synthetically true and make an existential claim, the analytically true version is going to be true, but only true of a pure object that doesn't exist in the same realm that we do. The synthetically true statement would support the ontological argument, showing that an existent perfect being exists in the actual world, but itself is unsupported by Meinong's theories, and therefore we have no reason at all to accept it. So, premise 3, therefore the existent perfect being exists. Either the statement is analytic, and existence is not implied, so it doesn't support the next step, the conclusion of the argument, or it is synthetic, and the characterization principle does not justify it. So, either it supports the next step of the argument, and is unsupported itself, or it is supported itself, but doesn't support the next step of the argument. Therefore, God exists. This can only be implied by a synthetic statement, so Meinong's characterization principle doesn't justify it, because the characterization principle only deals with analytic statements. I apologize if that was a little confusing. I hope if you check out the other videos that it may make some more sense. It's important to note that neither Meinong nor his contemporary supporters have endorsed this argument. It's simply an argument using the form and the ideas presented by Meinong, because he actually has a really interesting ontology, which I'd encourage you to check out. That was the Meinongian Ontological Argument for the Existence of God and some objections to it. Next up is the Mariological Ontological Argument, the Religious Experience Ontological Argument, and the Higher Order Ontological Argument. Watch this video and more at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.